Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you said earlier, this is a quote I wrote down when you were answering a question from one of my colleagues. We have 12 years within which to make decisions to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. In regards to that quote, then my question would be, what is the U.S. doing to force China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, the 12 years, first of all, was set by the scientists. Not my number, it's their number. They say that's the framework.
Regardless, you adopted that as truth today before the committee.
I adopt the best science in the world as a good guidepost for good governance. And I think that's what we need to exercise. Now,
if you're the special envoy on behalf of the president working on climate issues, and you take the position that we have 12 years within which to make decisions to avoid the, quote, worst consequences, then what are you doing to force China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, I'm going there to start with, but I'm not sure that that presence alone is enough to force them. But we're certainly
that, it's a reasonable question. I mean, you've been asked to do this. I didn't ask you to do it. The president asked you to go abroad and to have this conversation with China. And so I want to know, what are we going to do to twist their arm?
It's the use of the word force. I think that it's important to have a dialogue about how you can both reach agreement to do
replace
things
the word
that are
force
sensible.
with influence. What are you going to do to influence China to reduce its CO2 emissions?
Well, we've had very successful rounds of meetings with them and have moved significantly. China, let me give you an idea of what China is doing now in response to some of the pressure that I think has been evident.
I want to get real specific about actions you're going to ask them to do. What actions are you going to go to the table?
Well, we're looking at the
We need
CBAM.
you
I
to
told
do
you. We're looking very closely at the CBAM, as is Europe and other countries. We're looking at other ways to be able to try. But our preference is to have China say, yeah, that makes sense.
But China hasn't, because in the past decade, as you know, we've reduced emissions here in the United States, but in the same time frame, China's emissions have increased. All the while, they continue to say, we're working on it. And all the while, you continue to go over there and ask them to work on it, but we have not seen real deliberate action on their part to match the U.S.'s efforts in this regard. Is that correct?
We have actually seen some action which isn't evident to everybody because people, they don't advertise it. But I'll tell you what's happening. Let me just answer your question. China is manufacturing and deploying more renewable energy than all the rest of the world put together. That's what they're doing. China right now has about somewhere in the vicinity of a couple of thousand gigawatts, but they're now going up. And by 2030, our judgment is China may well be around 2,200, 2,400 gigawatts of renewable.
The pollution that's coming out of China
far
exceeds.
That's exactly why we're working at what we're doing.
And you said yourself, quote, earlier, this is a global, universal issue, and we don't want it to become captive to other issues. But I'm curious, when you say that, if you're ignoring these other issues like my colleague brought up here, human rights issues, would you agree that human rights issues are also global, universal issues?
Absolutely.
But you want to keep them separate when you're talking to China, is what you said earlier. Is that true?
What I said is, well, no, we don't keep them separate in terms of our priorities.
No, that's exactly what you
there.
said. You said President Xi and President Biden agreed at the outset to separate out the climate issue
Correct.
so it wouldn't get caught up in these other issues.
Correct.
So were you correct?
That doesn't mean you don't talk about them,
well,
but it means that they're not going to become showstoppers so that they're playing one off against the other. I'll give you an example. We don't trade any component of any of those other issues for what we're trying to do on the climate front. On the climate front, we've agreed we will deal with that, and we have to find a pathway forward. And there are others, the Assistant Secretary of State, the Secretary of State, the NSC, who deal directly on those other issues.
Okay, and I presume that you're
you know what we're trying to do? We're trying to make sure that you don't have to worry that John Kerry is going to give away some right on human rights in order to get what he's trying to get.
So I get that, and I presume
that's what we're
I
doing.
presume that you're going to have conferences with your counterparts that are having those discussions on those other issues, and that President Biden has said to you and those others which one is more priority over the other. So my question would be: is human rights the bigger issue? Is the slave labor coming out of the Uyghur
Congressman,
people
this
a bigger
administration
issue, or
is
is it the
capable of
climate
keeping
change?
all its priorities on the table and of treating all of them simultaneously. But we don't have to wrap them up so one becomes hostage to the other, or you don't make progress.
You plan to
You
hold
got
China accountable if they do not follow through with the activities that you're going to suggest and to reduce their emissions, because they're able to get ahead of our economy by producing many more emissions and having less regulatory action on their businesses than we are here in the United
And we don't
States.
want that to happen. That is
Then
precisely
how are you going to
why-
hold them accountable?
Because that's exactly why President Biden has asked us to examine the countervailing.
I have never
measures.
seen an examination hold anybody accountable. We need action to hold
Well,
them
that's
accountable.
exactly what's happening, and you've got several senators. You have some in the House. I believe there are a number of House members who are looking at the border adjustment mechanism. I know Senator Coons and some others in the House, Senator Whitehouse, have different plans for how to do that. This is gaining, I think, some steam legislatively because people are frustrated by what is happening. So, you know, you first got to come up with the legislation, and somehow it's got to pass the U.S. Congress writ large. So hopefully we can get there.
We don't legislate China, but we need to hold them accountable.
No, but you can legislate a CBAM.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Dean.